Behind every golden crown and marble palace, some royal families ruled not with wisdom, but with poison, betrayal, and steel. From secret police and fratricide to popes who killed for politics, these dynasties didn't just reign, they survived by destroying anyone who got in their way, even their own. Let's take a look at some of the most cruel imperial families in history, where the fight for power was soaked in blood, and no one was safe, not even the heirs. Starting with the Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, it was one of the most feared and authoritarian regimes in Chinese history. What began as a revolution against Mongol rule quickly turned into an empire ruled by fear, suspicion, and blood. At its center was Zhu Yuanzhang, a man born into poverty, orphaned by famine, and raised in a Buddhist monastery. He witnessed firsthand the suffering of peasants under the crumbling Yuan dynasty. But what truly shaped him was war. As rebellion swept through China, Zhu joined a local insurgent group, rose through the ranks, and, through sheer cunning and brutality, eliminated rival leaders until he stood alone. In 1368, he declared himself emperor, founding the Ming Dynasty and taking the name Hongwu, meaning vast military power. But power didn't bring peace. It only deepened his fears. Haunted by the betrayal and chaos that had defined his rise, Hongwu ruled with a clenched fist. He became obsessed with loyalty, convinced that anyone, no matter how loyal, could one day become a threat. Ministers walked on eggshells. Scholars whispered behind closed doors. Even family members were not above suspicion. To crush dissent before it could form, he created the Jin Yue, an elite secret police force dressed in ornate uniforms, armed with imperial authority and loyal to no one but the emperor himself. These men operated above the law. They could arrest without warning, torture without evidence, and execute without trial. They acted in the shadows, and their targets often vanished without a trace. The results were catastrophic. Between 1380 and 1390, the Hongwu emperor carried out a series of purges that shook the empire to its core. Over 100,000 people were executed. Ministers were accused of treason for failing to bow low enough. Officials were tortured into false confessions, and once guilt was declared, entire families, children, servants, distant cousins, were slaughtered to prevent future revenge. The court became a haunted place, where silence was safer than service. No one knew who would be next. And yet for Hongwu, even that wasn't enough. But the bloodletting didn't stop with him. His son, Zhu Di, was never meant to inherit the throne. As the fourth son of Hongwu, he had military command, but not political favor. After Hongwu's death, the crown passed to his grandson, the teenage Zhu Yunwen, known posthumously as the Jianwen Emperor. He was idealistic, young, and determined to curb the influence of his powerful uncles, including Zhu Di. But Zhu Di was not a man to be sidelined. In 1399, he declared war on his nephew, launching a bloody uprising known as the Jingnan Campaign, or the Campaign to Pacify the Difficulty. Cities were torched, civilians slaughtered, and armies devastated one another across northern China. For 3 years, the country descended into chaos. By the time Zhu Di's forces breached the capital, Nanjing was engulfed in flames, and his nephew had vanished. Some say he died in the fire. Others believe he escaped, hunted for the rest of his life. Zhu Di then took the throne as the Yongle Emperor, but he didn't stop at victory. He systematically erased his nephew's existence. Edicts were destroyed, documents rewritten, monuments defaced. It was as if Jianwen had never ruled. And while Zhu Di is often remembered for his accomplishments, reopening the Grand Canal, sponsoring the voyages of Zheng He, and constructing the vast, awe-inspiring Forbidden City, his reign was just as steeped in fear and authoritarian control as his father's. Paranoia remained the foundation of power. Yongle empowered eunuchs, once mere servants, giving them direct command over imperial intelligence and military affairs. They became his eyes and ears, spying on ministers, arresting critics, and executing threats in secret dungeons below the palace. As later emperors took the throne, many withdrew from public life entirely, ruling from behind silk curtains, while eunuchs and shadowy advisors ran the empire. Power no longer came from merit, but from proximity to the throne. Corruption flourished, Whispers turned into death sentences. Across the provinces, the people suffered. Rebellions simmered. The military weakened from neglect and poor leadership. And while the Forbidden City gleamed under the sun, the empire behind its walls was rotting from within. In the Ming Dynasty, cruelty wasn't a last resort. It was a system, a machine that ran for nearly 3 centuries, until it finally tore itself apart. Next are the Borgias. While the Ming ruled through terror in the east, the Borgias mastered a different kind of cruelty. One wrapped in silk robes, whispered through confessionals, and delivered with poisoned wine. Rising from obscurity in Spain, the Borgia family began as minor nobles, ambitious, cunning, and determined to carve out a legacy far greater than their birthright allowed. When they arrived in Italy, they were seen as outsiders. But through calculated marriages, backroom deals, and a mastery of manipulation, they clawed their way up the church's hierarchy, proving that in Renaissance Rome, power wasn't inherited, it was taken. Their most infamous figure, Rodrigo Borgia, used every tool at his disposal to ascend the ranks of the church. He wasn't a man of God, he was a man of opportunity. Through bribery, blackmail, and favors owed in dark corners, Rodrigo bought his way into the papacy, securing election in 1492 as Pope Alexander VI. His appointment was a scandal even by Rome's already corrupt standards. Whispers swirled of bags of gold changing hands, of entire cardinal votes purchased like items at market. And once he held the keys to the church, he ruled not as a shepherd, but as a king. The Vatican under Alexander VI resembled a royal court more than a religious institution. Banquets overflowed with wine and scandal. His own children, whom he never denied despite his position as pope, were paraded publicly and granted titles of nobility. Rodrigo turned the papacy into a political weapon, wielding it to crush enemies, reward allies, and expand his family's influence across the Italian peninsula. Under his reign, the Vatican became less a holy sanctuary and more a stage for deadly politics. Cardinals were not chosen for virtue, but for loyalty. Positions were auctioned to the highest bidder. Entire regions were handed over in exchange for fealty. And behind the scenes, those who dared oppose the Borgias, rival families, critical clergy, even former allies, often died suddenly and mysteriously. Victims collapsed at dinners, fell ill after audiences, or simply vanished. The work, many believed, of the Borgias' favorite weapon, poison. Rumors claimed the family owned a supply of cantarella, a slow-acting, tasteless toxin said to be delivered in wine, figs, or on the tips of rings. In Borgia Rome, the chalice of communion and the cup of death were sometimes one and the same. Rodrigo's children were no less dangerous. They were his sharpest weapons. His son, Cesare Borgia, was molded for the church, made a cardinal in his early 20s. But beneath the robes and ritual, he was a soldier at heart, burning with ambition. When his brother Juan, Rodrigo's favored heir, was mysteriously found floating in the Tiber River, throat slashed and body stabbed multiple times, suspicion immediately fell on Cesare. No formal charges were brought, no investigation was pursued. The family simply moved on. With Juan gone, Cesare cast off the cardinal's robes and picked up the sword. Backed by his father's vast influence and Vatican gold, he raised an army of mercenaries and criminals, launching a ruthless campaign to carve out his own principality in central Italy. Towns that resisted were massacred, nobles were butchered, and rival families were eliminated under false pretenses of negotiation. Cesare ruled through terror and brilliance. He was admired by Machiavelli, a man who understood that to hold power, one must be willing to abandon morality altogether. And then there was Lucrezia Borgia, his sister, and the subject of centuries of rumor. Beautiful, educated, and politically astute, she was married off 3 times to forge alliances with powerful families. Her husbands met grisly ends. One was stabbed to death by Cesare's men, another possibly poisoned. Lucrezia was said to carry a ring with a hidden compartment, just large enough to conceal a few drops of poison. At lavish Vatican feasts, where enemies were guests and wine flowed like water, death could be served with a smile. Whether she was a pawn or a player remains debated. But what's certain is that Lucrezia navigated a world of daggers and deception with chilling poise. In the house of Borgia, love was a transaction, Loyalty was bought, and betrayal was punished, silently, swiftly, and often with a cup of wine. Despite their rise, the Borgias' grip on power eventually slipped. Rodrigo died. Cesare was betrayed, captured, and killed far from Rome. Lucrezia retreated to Ferrara, where she died young, her image forever stained by the family's shadow. Yet their legend refused to die. Next are the Plantagenet family. Before the Tudors took the English throne, there was the House of Plantagenet, rulers of England and vast swaths of France, whose power spanned from the mid-12th to the late 15th century. But behind the royal banners and medieval pageantry lay one of Europe's most turbulent dynasties, where blood ties offered no safety, and civil war was a family affair. They didn't just fight their enemies, they fought their fathers, brothers, wives, and sons. The story begins with Henry II, the formidable founder of the Plantagenet dynasty, a masterful ruler and cunning tactician. He forged an empire that stretched from the windswept highlands of Scotland to the sun-soaked vineyards of southern France. But even the mightiest of kings couldn't control his own bloodline. Henry's sons, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John, grew up in a world where loyalty was a mask and ambition ran in the veins. Encouraged by their mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, they turned against their father in a series of betrayals that fractured the empire from within. Eleanor, once Queen of France and one of the most powerful women in Europe, conspired with her sons to seize power. For this, Henry imprisoned her for over 15 years. In the Plantagenet world, even a crown could become a death sentence, and a mother's love, a weapon. When Henry finally died, defeated and heartbroken, it was Richard the Lionheart, his rebellious son, who took the throne. Richard was a warrior king, more at home on the battlefield than in court. He spent most of his reign crusading in the Holy Land, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his scheming brother John, who plotted against him in his absence. When Richard died without an heir, John claimed the crown. But John's legacy would be one of treachery, failure, and cruelty. Paranoid and brutal, he allegedly murdered his teenage nephew, Arthur of Brittany, to eliminate a rival. Some accounts claim John stabbed him personally before dumping the body in the Seine. Others say the boy was starved to death in a dungeon. Either way, Arthur vanished, and fear of John only grew. John's rule spiraled into disaster. He lost nearly all the Plantagenet lands in France, taxed his nobles into rebellion, and faced widespread hatred. Eventually, a coalition of barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that limited royal power and became a cornerstone of modern democracy. But at the time, it was a humiliating surrender for a king born into absolute authority. The Plantagenets ruled by blood and were undone by it. Yet the chaos of the early Plantagenets was just the beginning. The darkest days still lay ahead, as the dynasty would collapse into a series of civil wars that turned England into a battleground for over 3 decades. But perhaps the darkest chapter of the Plantagenets was yet to come. Centuries after Henry II's rise, the mighty Plantagenet house collapsed into one of history's most infamous family feuds, the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic civil war between 2 rival branches of the family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. It wasn't just a battle for the throne, it was a slow-motion implosion of a bloodline that had ruled for centuries. Cousin fought cousin, brothers betrayed brothers. Entire families were wiped out in a single battle, and trust became a luxury no one could afford. The conflict tore England apart from 1455 to 1487, with power shifting violently from one monarch to another. Kings were crowned and then deposed. Some were imprisoned, others quietly murdered. At one point, the child king Edward V and his brother vanished within the Tower of London, presumed murdered by their uncle, Richard III. In the House of Plantagenet, power was a curse passed down like a crown, heavy, bloody, and never secure. The war culminated in the reign of Richard III, a monarch remembered as both a capable ruler and a ruthless usurper. With his hunched back and iron will, he seized the crown after the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, but his hold on power was as brittle as the alliances around him. In 1485, Richard met his end at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Betrayed by his allies in the heat of battle, he charged alone into the fray, fighting fiercely, but was cut down. His battered body was thrown into an unmarked grave, only to be rediscovered over 500 years later. beneath a parking lot in Leicester, twisted and broken. For over 300 years, the Plantagenets ruled with ambition, brutality, and brilliance. But in the end, their greatest enemy was themselves. Their downfall marked the end of medieval England and the rise of a new dynasty born from the ashes, the Tudors. Next is an empire that survived for centuries by doing the unthinkable, murdering their own blood to keep the empire intact. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire stood as a towering force of history. Lasting over 6 centuries, it shaped continents, crushed empires, and defined the balance of power from Europe to the Middle East. Its armies marched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Its capital, Constantinople, became the jewel of the Islamic world. Behind the empire's opulence, its grand mosques, sprawling markets, and disciplined bureaucracy, was a dynasty obsessed not with legacy, but with survival at any cost. At the core of this obsession was fratricide, a cold, calculated policy of eliminating your own blood. In the Ottoman world, brotherhood was a liability, and mercy, a weakness the empire could not afford. This wasn't just a cruel tradition, it was law. Known as the Law of Fratricide, it was formally codified under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The law allowed a newly crowned sultan to legally execute any and all of his brothers. No trial, no appeal, no shame. The reasoning was simple. If killing a few could prevent a civil war that might destroy the empire, then the bloodshed was not only justified, but necessary. But necessity soon gave way to ritualized brutality. In 1595, Sultan Mehmed III came to power and immediately ordered the death of 19 of his brothers, all young boys and infants. They were strangled with silk cords, a method considered more dignified for royalty, as it spared the spilling of blood. Some were still playing in the gardens of the palace. Others were in their mother's arms. It was said the women's cries echoed through the corridors of Topkapi Palace, but the executions continued until the order was fulfilled. No ceremony, no mourning, just silence. Then, a coronation. The public never saw the bodies. They were quietly buried beneath the palace, and Mehmed's reign began, unopposed, but forever stained. He reportedly carried out the executions with a heavy heart, and some say the guilt consumed him. But the precedent had been set, and the message was clear. Power would be preserved by blood, even if it meant killing one's own kin. Over the centuries, the Ottoman throne would see sons kill brothers, brothers betray uncles, and mothers manipulate their children into survival or slaughter. The empire endured, but only by feeding on itself. In the Ottoman court, a mother's joy at childbirth was always tempered with dread, because sons meant rivals. From the moment a royal child was born, the struggle for survival began. And nowhere was this more apparent than within the walls of the imperial harem. Not a place of pleasure, but a political battlefield dressed in silk. Behind the ornate screens and velvet curtains, Valide sultans, mothers of reigning sultans, wielded unimaginable power. They brokered alliances, directed appointments, and whispered commands that could cost lives. In the harem, a subtle glance could be a death sentence, a misplaced word, a reason to vanish. Among the most formidable was Kozum Sultan, once a Greek slave. She rose to become not just a concubine, but the empire's de facto ruler through her sons and grandsons. She governed from behind the throne, issuing orders through palace scribes, reshaping foreign policy and orchestrating purges. But in a court built on betrayal, her fate was sealed. In 1651, her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, ordered her assassination. Kosem was strangled with her own curtain cords, killed in the same palace she once ruled. In the Ottoman world, power was always rented, never owned. But the bloodshed eventually proved unsustainable. To stop the endless cycle of executions, later sultans embraced a new cruelty, the cage. Known as the cafés, this golden prison was a secluded wing of the palace where royal princes were locked away, isolated for years, sometimes entire lifetimes. They were fed, guarded, entertained, but never allowed to leave. Many were denied education, companionship, or purpose. Some emerged years later to become sultans, paranoid, mentally broken, or entirely unfit to rule. Yet still, they ruled. Better a madman on the throne than a civil war in the streets. That was the Ottoman way. The empire endured through fear and blood until it couldn't anymore. By the early 1900s, the once glorious Ottomans, masters of conquest and cruelty, were collapsing under their own weight. The sultans had long since become figureheads, the harem was emptied, and the ancient palace was silent. The dynasty that ruled for over 600 years ended not with a sword but with exile. And lastly, the Romanovs, an empire that ruled through blood, spilled both by their enemies and their own hands. The Romanov dynasty rose to power in 1613 through Michael Romanov, elected at only 16 years old as Russia's Tsar, emerging from the ashes of the time of troubles, a period marked by famine, war, and political chaos. Seizing the throne during this vacuum of power, the Romanovs fashioned themselves not just as rulers, but as divinely chosen sovereigns, ordained by God to govern the vast Russian Empire. Their authority was absolute, their word law, and their enemies disposable. For over 300 years, the Romanovs ruled from palaces, gilded in gold, surrounded by courtiers, opulence, and sacred ceremony. But beneath the glittering surface was a dynasty built on repression, where blood loyalty was demanded, and dissent was a death sentence. Even within the royal household, trust was rare, and betrayal could be fatal. The seeds of cruelty were sown early. Peter the Great, praised as the visionary who dragged Russia into modernity, ruled with an iron fist. His reforms were revolutionary, but they came at a terrible human cost. He beheaded rebels himself, forced nobles to adopt Western customs under threat of death, and used the military and secret police to crush opposition. When his own son Alexei was suspected of conspiring against him, Peter had him arrested, brutally tortured, and ultimately executed, a father sacrificing his child for the sake of the state. In the Romanov world, love never stood above loyalty, and loyalty was enforced with fear. Following Peter's reign, the dynasty continued its legacy of blood and control. Successors like Catherine the Great expanded the empire, but silenced critics with secret police, forced labor camps, and a rigid hierarchy that placed the Tsar above all. But even Catherine herself had clawed her way to power through treachery. She orchestrated a coup against her husband, Peter III, with the help of her lover and the Imperial Guard. Peter was soon captured and mysteriously died in custody, most likely murdered. Catherine then ruled as empress for over 3 decades, cementing her legacy as both an enlightened monarch and a ruthless usurper. Her court was a chessboard of seductions and schemes. Lovers like Grigory Orlov and Grigory Potemkin were both confidants and pawns, while rivals were exiled, discredited, or erased. In this world, suspicion was the state religion. Rumors carried weight, and secrets were as valuable as armies. Nobles were executed on whispers, heirs kept under watch, and Tsars often trusted no one, not even their own blood. Those who spoke against the crown were often sentenced to lifelong exile in the frozen wastelands of Siberia, where death came slowly and escape was impossible. Palace intrigues became commonplace. Empresses were overthrown, lovers poisoned, and heirs locked away to rot in isolated dungeons. The Russian court was a gilded cage, where loyalty shifted like snow on the steppes and ambition often ended in blood. Tsar Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great, lived under his mother's shadow and ruled with increasing instability, issuing bizarre decrees and alienating the nobility. In 1801, he was strangled to death in his own bedroom by a group of disaffected nobles, possibly with the silent blessing of his son, Alexander I. Behind the grandeur of imperial Russia stood a legacy of whispered plots, secret deaths, and a throne soaked in suspicion. This ruthless environment was not an aberration. It was a Romanov tradition, one passed down through generations like a sacred duty. But perhaps no Romanov embodied the dynasty's madness and decay more than Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. Nicholas was a man raised to rule, but never trained to lead. Shy, deeply religious, and fiercely committed to absolute monarchy, he clung to divine right, like a drowning man to driftwood, even as his empire cracked beneath his feet. As strikes and protests spread through the streets of St. Petersburg, Nicholas responded not with reform, but with brutality, ordering troops to open fire on unarmed civilians during Bloody Sunday in 1905. It was a massacre that stained his reign and set the stage for revolution. But perhaps his greatest folly was allowing his rule to be shaped by Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic and self-proclaimed holy man. Rasputin gained the trust of the royal family by easing the suffering of Nicholas's hemophiliac son, Alexei. But in return, he gained unprecedented access to the corridors of power, making decisions on government appointments and influencing state policy. Ministers feared him, nobles despised him, and the public, they were scandalized. While Russian soldiers bled in the trenches of World War I, Rasputin held court in the palace, drunk on power, and perhaps more. Nicholas's refusal to see the storm gathering around him would cost his family everything. In 1917, amid war, famine, and fury, the February Revolution exploded. Nicholas was forced to abdicate. The Romanovs, once gods among men, became prisoners in their own country. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, Nicholas, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children were led into a room, told they were being moved for safety. Moments later, they were gunned down by Bolshevik soldiers. The daughters stabbed with bayonets because jewels sewn into their dresses had deflected bullets. Their bodies were mutilated, doused in acid, and buried in unmarked graves. No trial, no mercy, just silence. The empire ended as it lived, under the shadow of death. What the Romanovs left behind was not merely a fallen crown or shattered lineage. They left behind a cautionary tale of power unyielding, of arrogance unchecked, and of rulers who forgot the people until it was too late. If you enjoyed diving into the dark side of history, hit that like button, subscribe for more ruthless rulers, and drop a comment. Which dynasty do you think was the most twisted of them all?